black female billionaire faces rejection at a Michelin-starred restaurant, not because of her status, but because of her appearance. Fueled by determination, she quietly buys the restaurant and transforms it into an inclusive powerhouse, forcing those who once judged her to confront their own biases. But as she changes the fate of the establishment, will karma deliver a final twist she didn't see coming? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Mariah Parker stepped out of her sleek car, the cold night air brushing against her skin as the valet approached. The restaurant in front of her radiated exclusivity, with its polished glass doors, dimmed golden lights, and the subtle hum of refined conversation coming from within. It was one of those places people whispered about, the kind of Michelin-starred establishment where securing a reservation was nearly impossible. Yet for Mariah, getting that reservation had been the easy part. After all, she was one of the wealthiest women in the country, and her influence knew no bounds. Tonight, though, she wasn't here as a billionaire. She had no entourage, no grand announcement of her arrival. Dressed in a sophisticated but understated black dress, she wanted to experience the restaurant for what it claimed to be, an oasis of luxury and culinary excellence. But as she approached the hostess stand, something in the air shifted. The hostess, a young woman in her mid-20s with perfectly coiffed hair and an air of practiced politeness, looked up with a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But that flicker quickly disappeared, replaced by something Mariah recognized too well, disdain hidden behind a thin veil of formality. "Good evening," Mariah said, her voice soft yet confident. "I have a reservation for Parker, at 8 p.m. The hostess's eyes scanned the list before her, her smile thinning. "Parker?" she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. "Yes, Parker," Mariah confirmed, noticing the slight hesitation. She felt the familiar prickle of irritation but held her composure. The hostess's fingers hovered over the list for a moment too long, her eyes flicking up to meet Mariah's with that same veiled expression. "I'm sorry, Miss Parker, but I don't seem to see a reservation here for you." Mariah raised an eyebrow, already anticipating where this was headed. She had seen this play out before, in subtle ways that left no trace of overt discrimination, but enough to let her know what was really happening. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her emails until she found the reservation confirmation and held it out for the hostess to see. "It's right here," Mariah said calmly. "Confirmed for tonight at 8 p.m. The hostess glanced at the phone screen, her smile faltering for a moment before returning in full force, but now with an air of condescension. "I see," she said slowly. "There must have been some sort of mistake because we don't have any tables available this evening. We're fully booked." Mariah's jaw tightened, but she didn't let her frustration show. "Fully booked? Even though I had a confirmed reservation?" The hostess hesitated, looking over Mariah's shoulder as if searching for someone to rescue her from the conversation. "Yes, I'm afraid so. I apologize for the inconvenience, but there's really nothing I can do tonight." Mariah glanced around. Through the large glass windows, she could see empty tables scattered across the dining room, some still being set up for the evening. Clearly, the restaurant was not as packed as the hostess had claimed. But it wasn't the empty tables that stung. It was the unspoken reason she was being turned away, her skin color, her identity. It wasn't new to her, but it never became easier. "Right," Mariah said, her voice now cool. She could have caused a scene. She could have mentioned her wealth, her status, or made a few calls that would have turned the restaurant's management on its head. But that wasn't who she was. She didn't need to flex her power to prove a point, especially not here, in front of someone who wouldn't understand the complexities of the life Mariah had lived. She took a step back, slipping her phone back into her purse. "I'll be sure to leave a review," she said quietly, but there was steel behind her words. The hostess blinked, her practiced smile still in place. "Thank you for understanding, Miss Parker. We hope to see you again soon." Mariah turned on her heel, her head held high as she walked out of the restaurant, the sound of her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The valet hurried to bring her car back around, but the cold wind that whipped across her face wasn't what sent the chill through her. It was the sting of knowing, once again, that no matter how high she climbed, no matter how successful she became, there would always be people who saw her as less. Not because of her accomplishments, her intelligence, or her wealth, but because of the color of her skin. As she slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual. She sat in silence for a moment, the anger simmering just below the surface. But Mariah wasn't one to lash out in anger. No, she believed in something much more powerful: karma. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar resolve settle in her chest. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. People who underestimated her had always learned the hard way that Mariah Parker wasn't someone to be dismissed lightly. And this restaurant, this hostess, this cold, calculated rejection, it would all come back around. Mariah would make sure of it. But for now, she drove away, already formulating the next steps in her mind. Mariah drove through the city streets, her mind drifting back to the moments that had led her here. She wasn't angry, not in the way most people would expect. The anger she felt had long ago been replaced by something else: determination. Determination to prove, over and over, that she was more than the sum of other people's assumptions. But tonight had stirred something deeper inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The memories began to surface, unbidden, as the rhythmic hum of the engine drowned out the noise of the city. She thought back to her childhood, a time when the world seemed so much simpler, but the seeds of prejudice had already begun to take root. Mariah had grown up in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever really changed. Her parents had been hard-working, salt-of-the-earth people. Her mother, a school teacher, had instilled in her the love of learning, always reminding her that education was the key to unlocking the doors that might otherwise remain closed. Her father, a mechanic, was the embodiment of resilience. He had always said, "You fix what's broken, Mariah. You don't throw it away." But no amount of love and wisdom from her parents could shield her from the harsh realities of the world outside their home. Mariah remembered her first taste of discrimination clearly. She had been 10, sitting in her 5th grade classroom when the teacher asked a question about a math problem. Mariah had been the first to raise her hand, but the teacher had ignored her, calling on another student instead. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The sting of being overlooked, of being deemed less capable because of who she was, had started early. But even then, Mariah had a fire in her. She excelled in her studies, driven by the need to prove herself, to prove that she was just as smart, just as capable, just as deserving as anyone else. She had always been competitive, not because she wanted to beat others, but because she wanted to beat the expectations others had of her. By the time she graduated from high school, Mariah had earned a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Her parents were proud, of course, but they also knew what awaited her. They had always been honest about the world she was stepping into. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as much," her mother had said. It was a bitter truth, but one Mariah had already begun to understand. College had been no different. While her peers enjoyed their newfound freedom, Mariah had focused on her studies with laser-like precision. She had little time for parties or socializing. Instead, she spent her nights buried in textbooks, determined to come out on top. And she did. Graduating at the top of her class, she entered the business world with more accolades than most, but still, the doors didn't open as easily as they should have. Mariah had seen it time and time again, the hesitation, the doubt, the subtle undercurrent of disbelief when she walked into a room. Even as she climbed the corporate ladder, securing deals and clients with ease, there were always those who seemed surprised by her success, as if her very existence defied their expectations. But Mariah had never let that stop her. She pushed harder, climbed higher, determined to shatter every ceiling that stood in her way. Her first breakthrough came when she launched her own company. It had started as a small venture, a tech startup in an already crowded industry. But Mariah had vision. She knew where the market was headed before most people even had an inkling. Her company grew rapidly, and within a few years, she was being hailed as one of the most influential businesswomen in the country. But with success came more challenges. The higher she rose, the more visible she became. and the more people seemed to scrutinize her. Every move she made was analyzed, every decision questioned. Investors, clients, even her peers often doubted her abilities, assuming that she had somehow gotten lucky or that there was someone else behind her success. The reality of being a black woman in a white, male-dominated industry was one of constant vigilance. She remembered one particularly glaring incident. Early in her career, she had been invited to a high-profile business meeting with a group of investors. It was a huge opportunity, the kind that could make or break a company. Mariah had walked into the boardroom, prepared as always, but the moment she sat down, she knew something was wrong. The investors barely acknowledged her, directing their questions to the man sitting next to her, who was in fact her assistant. It had taken every ounce of her self-control not to let her frustration show. When the investors finally turned to her, it was clear they had no idea who she was. They spoke to her as if she were the assistant, not the CEO. But Mariah had handled it with grace. She answered their questions, laid out her vision, and by the end of the meeting, they were practically throwing money at her. They never apologized for their initial assumptions, of course, but Mariah didn't need an apology. Their investment was apology enough. These moments had shaped her, built her into the woman she was today. She had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for her, and in doing so, she had built her own empire. But even now, with billions in the bank, a fleet of companies under her control, and the kind of influence that could sway entire markets, moments like tonight still reminded her of the harsh truth. Some people would never see past the surface. As she pulled into her driveway, the memory of the restaurant's rejection still lingered in her mind. It wasn't just about being turned away from a table. It was about being reminded yet again that for some, her wealth, her success, her status, all of it meant nothing because of the color of her skin. But Mariah wasn't the kind of woman to let that go unanswered. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with people who underestimated her was to prove them wrong in ways they could never have imagined. She stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around her as she walked toward her front door. Tomorrow, she would make some calls. Not to complain, but to begin the process of acquiring something that had been on her radar for a while. The restaurant that had dismissed her so easily tonight would soon learn that karma had a way of working itself out. And Mariah was always one step ahead of karma. The next morning, Mariah sat at her desk in her sunlit home office, the large windows framing a serene view of the manicured gardens outside. The contrast between the calm surroundings and the fire brewing inside her was stark. She wasn't angry. Anger was fleeting, impulsive. What Mariah felt was focus, a calculated determination to take action, to turn the previous night's slight into an opportunity. She scrolled through her emails, her mind already processing the necessary steps. The restaurant that had treated her so poorly was not just any establishment. It was part of a larger luxury hospitality group, a group she had been eyeing for acquisition for some time now. This was no mere coincidence, but a perfect alignment of opportunity and poetic justice. Mariah had built her business empire on seizing moments like this, when personal and professional goals intersected. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Within moments, her trusted executive assistant, James, was on the line. "Good morning, James," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I need you to schedule a meeting with the legal and acquisitions team. There's a company we're going to purchase, and I want everything moving as quickly as possible." James, ever efficient, didn't need to ask for details. He knew Mariah's tone well, and when she was in this kind of mood, things moved fast. "Consider it done," he replied. "I'll have everything in motion by the end of the day." Mariah hung up and leaned back in her chair, her mind already several steps ahead. She could picture the moment she'd walk back into that restaurant, not as a dismissed guest, but as the new owner. The thought didn't fill her with the kind of petty satisfaction one might expect. It was about more than that. It was about shifting the power dynamic, about teaching a lesson to those who still believed they could judge and dismiss someone based solely on appearances. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of meetings, negotiations, and legal paperwork. As always, Mariah approached the acquisition with the same laser-like precision she applied to all her ventures. The hospitality group, which owned several upscale restaurants and boutique hotels, had been struggling for some time, despite their reputation for exclusivity and luxury. The group's CEO had been eager to offload a few properties, and Mariah's offer, quietly delivered through intermediaries, was more than generous. By the time the deal was finalized, Mariah had secured not only the restaurant but a controlling interest in the entire group. It wasn't just a strategic business move, it was personal. And now, she had control over a brand that had once turned her away. The irony wasn't lost on her. Finally, the day came. Mariah decided to return to the restaurant, but this time, there would be no hesitation at the door. No questioning glances or dismissive smiles. She had orchestrated her return perfectly, ensuring that the staff had no idea she was now their employer. She wanted to see their reactions firsthand. As she approached the entrance, everything felt the same as before. The elegant facade, the warm lights filtering through the windows. But this time, Mariah felt different. She wasn't walking in as a guest. She was walking in as someone who now owned the very place that had once refused her. She stepped through the doors, her heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. The hostess, unfortunately the same young woman from her last visit, looked up, her face instantly showing a flicker of recognition. But something about Mariah's calm confidence seemed to give the hostess pause. There was no immediate rejection this time, just a slight tension in her smile. "Good evening," Mariah said, with the same measured grace as before. "I have a reservation for Parker." The hostess's eyes flicked down to the list, and Mariah could almost feel her heart skip a beat. This time, the reservation was there, because Mariah had made sure of it herself. The hostess nodded quickly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Right this way, Miss Parker," she said, her voice more deferential than before. Mariah followed her to a beautifully set table near the window, the best seat in the house. She settled into the chair, scanning the room. It was just as she remembered, luxurious, filled with the quiet murmur of wealthy diners. But tonight, there was an added layer of satisfaction as she knew what was coming next. Just as the sommelier approached her table with the wine list, the restaurant's general manager appeared, his face slightly flushed. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a meticulous appearance and an air of superiority that had been carefully cultivated over years of dealing with high-end clientele. "Miss Parker," he began, his voice smooth but there was an underlying unease. "Welcome back to our establishment. I hope everything is to your liking this evening." Mariah looked up, her expression unreadable. "So far, so good," she replied, her tone polite, but laced with something the manager couldn't quite place. The manager hovered awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. It was then that Mariah decided to reveal the truth. "I'm glad you've joined us," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I wanted to let you know that as of last week, I'm now the majority shareholder in the hospitality group that owns this restaurant." The manager's face drained of color. He blinked, his composure faltering for the briefest of moments. Congratulations, Miss Parker," he stammered. "We were not aware of that development." Mariah smiled faintly. "I know, but now that you are, I'd like to have a discussion with you and the head chef after my meal. There are some changes I'm considering implementing." The manager nodded quickly, his posture stiff as he muttered something about making sure her meal was perfect. He hurried away, and Mariah returned to her menu, the sense of poetic justice settling over her like a warm blanket. She wasn't here to gloat or to revel in anyone's discomfort. No, she had a much bigger plan in mind. By the time dessert was served, the general manager and head chef had been summoned to her table. They stood nervously, unsure of what to expect. Mariah, ever calm, looked up at them with the same poised expression she had worn when she first walked through the door that night. "I don't plan on firing anyone," she began, watching the relief wash over their faces. "But I do plan on making changes. This restaurant, and the entire group, will undergo a transformation. We will become known not just for our food, but for how we treat every guest who walks through our doors." She let her words sink in before continuing. "I experienced something here that I won't allow to happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. We'll be instituting mandatory training on diversity and inclusion for all staff. This place will reflect the values of respect and equality, starting from the top down. The manager and chef exchanged uneasy glances, but neither dared to object. Mariah's voice was soft, but carried the weight of someone who wasn't asking for permission. She was telling them how things would be. And one more thing, she added. I'll be keeping a close eye on how these changes are implemented. Consider this an opportunity, not a punishment. If we can make this restaurant a place where everyone feels welcome, then it will thrive. With that, she dismissed them, watching as they scurried away to process the new reality. Mariah leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction, not from revenge, but from knowing she had used her power to effect real change. Over the next few months, the transformation Mariah had envisioned for the restaurant and the entire hospitality group began to take shape. It wasn't an overnight process, nor did she expect it to be. Changing the culture of an organization so steeped in exclusivity and subtle prejudice required patience, persistence, and most importantly, leadership by example. Mariah spent time with her new staff, not as a distant figure issuing commands from the top, but as an active presence. She knew that to truly make a difference, she needed to understand the inner workings of the restaurant, from the kitchen to the front of house. She didn't just sit in her corner office or delegate every responsibility to her managers. Instead, she showed up unannounced, quietly observing how her staff interacted with guests, how they worked under pressure, and how they responded to the subtle cues of bias that often went unnoticed. The first major change Mariah implemented was the diversity and inclusion training. It was mandatory, not just for the waitstaff but for everyone, chefs, managers, sommeliers, even the cleaning staff. Mariah brought in experts who specialized in unconscious bias training, and she made it clear that this was not just a one-time session to check a box. This was an ongoing process with regular workshops, open discussions, and continuous education. At first, the reception was mixed. Some staff embraced the change, recognizing the importance of creating a more inclusive environment. They were excited about the chance to learn, to grow, and to be part of something larger than themselves. But others, particularly those who had been with the restaurant for years, resisted. They saw the changes as unnecessary, a disruption to the way things had always been done. For them, the restaurant's reputation had been built on exclusivity, and they feared that by opening the doors to everyone, they would lose what made them special. Mariah anticipated this resistance, but she didn't back down. Instead, she approached it with the same calm determination that had brought her success in the business world. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with the most vocal detractors, listening to their concerns, but also making it clear that the changes were non-negotiable. During one of these meetings, Mariah sat across from Charles, the head chef, who had been with the restaurant for over a decade. He was a man of great talent, but also one set in his ways. He had built his career on the idea that his restaurant catered to a certain kind of clientele, those who could afford the best and who expected exclusivity in return. "I understand where you're coming from, Charles," Mariah said, her voice measured but firm. "But I need you to understand something too. This isn't about lowering our standards, it's about expanding them. We're not losing what makes this restaurant special, we're enhancing it. And that starts with how we treat people." Charles frowned, his arms crossed over his chest. "I've always treated our customers with respect," he said defensively. "But this place isn't for everyone. It's for people who appreciate fine dining, who understand what we're about." Mariah nodded, acknowledging his perspective. "I don't doubt your respect for our customers, but let me ask you this. Who decides who deserves to be here? Is it just about money, status, appearance? We can still be the best restaurant in the city, while also being a place where everyone feels welcome, where they aren't judged before they even sit down to eat." Charles shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "But what if it changes the atmosphere? What if we lose that sense of exclusivity?" Mariah leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Exclusivity isn't about turning people away because they don't look a certain way. It's about creating an experience so unique and remarkable that people want to come back. That's where you come in. You're a brilliant chef, Charles. The food you create is already exclusive in the sense that no one else can replicate it. But we can do better than that. we can create an atmosphere where people leave feeling like they were part of something special, not just because of the food, but because of how they were treated. Charles was quiet for a moment, his eyes downcast as he considered her words. Mariah didn't push further. She knew that change, especially in someone so entrenched in their ways, didn't happen overnight. But she also knew that if she could get him to see the value in what they were trying to accomplish, he would become one of her strongest allies. Over the next few weeks, Mariah continued to push forward with her changes. The diversity training sessions became a regular part of the restaurant's operations, and slowly the resistance began to soften. Staff members who had initially been skeptical started to see the benefits, not just in terms of creating a more welcoming environment, but in how it enhanced the overall experience for their guests. The restaurant began to attract a broader, more diverse clientele, people who had once felt intimidated or unwelcome by the establishment's reputation now found themselves drawn in by its newfound inclusivity. Word spread quickly that the restaurant was not only a place for fine dining, but also a place where every guest, regardless of who they were or what they looked like, was treated with the same level of respect and care. One evening, Mariah returned to the restaurant not as the owner checking in on her staff, but as a guest. She had reserved a table under a different name, curious to see how the changes were playing out without anyone knowing she was there. The moment she stepped through the doors, she felt the difference. The atmosphere was still elegant, still luxurious, but there was a warmth to it now, a sense of openness that hadn't been there before. The hostess greeted her with a genuine smile, leading her to a table near the window. As she sat down, Mariah watched the staff move through the dining room, interacting with guests of all backgrounds: young couples, families, business professionals, tourists. It was a diverse mix of people, yet they all shared one thing in common. They were enjoying their experience, not just because of the food, but because of how they were being treated. The manager approached her table, unaware of who she was. "Good evening, ma'am," he said with a polite smile. "I hope everything is to your satisfaction." Mariah smiled back, nodding. "It is, thank you. The service has been wonderful." He bowed slightly and moved on, and Mariah leaned back in her chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. This was what she had envisioned, a place where people could come together, where the quality of the food was matched by the quality of the experience. It wasn't about exclusivity anymore. It was about creating something exceptional for everyone. But Mariah wasn't done yet. The restaurant was only the beginning. She had plans to extend this new philosophy to the entire hospitality group, making inclusivity and respect the cornerstones of every property they owned. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be more resistance along the way. But Mariah had always thrived in the face of challenges. She didn't just fix what was broken, she rebuilt it stronger than before. As she took a sip of her wine, watching the restaurant hum with life, Mariah knew that this was only the start of something much bigger. The road ahead was long, but she was ready for it. Months passed, and the changes Mariah implemented at the restaurant were yielding remarkable results. Word had spread beyond the restaurant's walls, not only about its exquisite cuisine, but also about the welcoming and inclusive atmosphere that had transformed the once exclusive establishment. For the first time in its history, the restaurant was gaining recognition not just from food critics, but also from publications that highlighted its groundbreaking approach to hospitality. The restaurant wasn't the only place undergoing a transformation. Mariah had taken her vision of inclusivity and applied it to the entire hospitality group she now controlled. Every property, from boutique hotels to other high-end restaurants, was put through the same rigorous process of change, with diversity and respect becoming integral parts of their brand identity. And it wasn't just a token effort, it was a fundamental shift in how the group operated. Staff training had become a priority not only in addressing bias, but in fostering empathy and understanding. The clientele became more diverse, and as people of all backgrounds started to frequent the establishments, the group's profits soared. What Mariah had known from the start had become a reality. Inclusivity wasn't a weakness or a compromise, it was a strength. It was the new hallmark of excellence. But tonight was special. Tonight, Mariah returned to the restaurant that had once rejected her. Not as the owner conducting business, but as a guest. There was no grand entrance, no announcement of her presence. She wanted to experience the full circle of her journey, to sit down in the very place where she had once been turned away and simply enjoy a meal. She made a reservation under a different name, as she had done before, ensuring that no one would know she was coming. As she walked through the front doors, the atmosphere felt familiar yet different. The restaurant still had the air of luxury and sophistication, but there was a new warmth to it. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before, filled with people from all walks of life, each enjoying the experience without the weight of judgment or exclusion hanging over them. The hostess, a new face Mariah hadn't met before, greeted her with a smile. There was no hesitation, no subtle pause of judgment. "Good evening and welcome. Do you have a reservation?" "I do," Mariah replied with a nod. "It's under the name Williams." The hostess scanned her list and found the reservation immediately. "Right this way, Miss Williams." Mariah followed her to a table by the window, the same table where she had been seated the last time she dined here. The hostess handed her the menu with a warm smile before excusing herself. As Mariah settled into her seat, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey she had taken to arrive at this moment. It wasn't just about reclaiming a seat at the table. It was about how much had changed, not just for her, but for the people who walked through those doors every day. She watched as waitstaff moved seamlessly through the room, serving guests of all backgrounds with the same attentiveness and respect. Families, couples, and individuals dined side by side, unaware of the history that had once divided them from this experience. As she studied the menu, the sommelier approached her table. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, and his demeanor was professional yet friendly. "Good evening, Miss Williams. May I recommend a wine pairing for you tonight?" he asked. Mariah looked up, smiling. "That sounds perfect." He began to describe a selection of wines that would pair beautifully with her meal. But as he spoke, Mariah found herself reflecting on just how far things had come. It wasn't that the staff knew who she was or treated her differently because of her status. It was that they treated her the same as they treated everyone else, with the respect and dignity that every person deserved. The general manager, now fully on board with Mariah's vision, made his way through the restaurant, greeting guests and checking in with tables. When he reached Mariah's table, he gave her a nod and a warm smile. "Good evening, ma'am. I hope you're enjoying your meal." Mariah returned the smile. "I am, thank you. Everything's wonderful." He didn't linger, nor did he recognize her, but the interaction was genuine, and that's all she had ever wanted. She didn't need to be singled out or treated as a VIP. She wanted to see that the restaurant was living up to the new standards she had set. And it was. As Mariah enjoyed her meal, a sense of peace settled over her. She thought back to that first night, the cold rejection she had faced, and how it had ignited something in her. She had known then that she had the power to change the narrative, not just for herself, but for others who would come after her. The discrimination she had faced was no longer a source of pain. It had become a catalyst for transformation. The restaurant was now a symbol of what could be achieved when prejudice was challenged and change was embraced. It had gone from being an exclusive space that judged people based on superficial factors to becoming a place of inclusivity, where everyone was welcome, and where the quality of the experience was measured by more than just the food. As dessert arrived, a beautifully plated confection that looked almost too good to eat, Mariah couldn't help but smile. She had rebuilt more than just a restaurant. She had redefined what it meant to belong. She had taken a place that once stood as a bastion of elitism and transformed it into something far greater, a beacon of change and progress. After finishing her meal, Mariah sat back and watched the room, the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the quiet elegance of a place she now felt truly reflected her vision. It was a place where everyone, regardless of their background, was given the same opportunity to enjoy a remarkable dining experience. As she prepared to leave, the hostess appeared once more to bid her farewell. "Thank you for dining with us, Miss Williams. We hope to see you again soon." Mariah stood and gave the hostess a kind smile. "You definitely will." She walked out into the night, the cool air brushing against her skin as she made her way to her car. This time, there was no bitterness, no lingering sting of rejection. Instead, there was satisfaction, a quiet sense of victory, not over the people who had wronged her, but over the system that had allowed such treatment to persist for so long. She had turned her personal experience into a catalyst for change, and in doing so, she had created something lasting. It wasn't about revenge, it was about progress, about using her power and influence to ensure that no one else would have to experience what she had. As Mariah drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the glowing lights of the restaurant fading into the distance. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey, but a significant chapter had closed. The story of rejection had turned into one of triumph and change. And for Mariah, that was the true definition of success. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.